Newton gave us Newtonian physics. Einstein gave us relativity. Satoshi gave us money. And it's this thing we call Bitcoin. And so if you're not actually investing, you're getting poorer.
안녕하세요. 비트 김 선생입니다. 6월 14일 15시 50분 기준 비트코인 가격 66.9K에 위치해주고 있습니다. 오늘 66K 부근까지 하락했으나 66K 부근에서 다시 말아 올려주면서 67K 부근에서 다시 박스권을 만들어 주었습니다. ETF 유입량은 유입에서 다시 약 226만 달러 유출로 전환되었습니다. 많은 분들이 떨어지는 거 아니냐 걱정하시는 분들도 많겠지만 오늘 그 걱정을 덜어드리기 위해 시장의 흐름, 왜 비트코인이 상승할 수밖에 없는지 얘기해주는 마이클 세일러의 인터뷰 영상을 가지고 왔습니다. 도움이 많이 되실 겁니다.
Fundamentally, people think currency is money, but really the academic definition of what is money is medium of exchange, a unit of account, a store of value. What is it really? Well, money is just, the most tradable good, the most durable, tradable element or unit of something that we can trade for something else of value. So in the history of the world, you go back 10,000 years, people might have traded seashells, or they traded stone coins or polished glass beads, or they might have traded arrowheads. What is the universal commodity that we know people will accept? And we use it to create a market economy, to solve the problem of coincidence of wants, right? Everybody produces something different. And you need to, and if you have stone axes and I have food, and, I want the stone axe and you want the food, we trade for some ratio. But if everybody doesn't have exactly what everybody else needs, that barter economy breaks down. It gets too complicated. The issue really is, how do you make those economies work? Through a process of trial and error, people eventually arrived at metals, copper coins, silver coins, then gold coins, and they worked with some kind of metallic unit of account and type of money. But even in modern era, you could see people use bales of tobacco as money in the colonies before the Revolutionary War. In prisons, people use cigarettes as money, and POWs use cigarettes as money. What's the problem? The problem is, in the modern era, we use fiat currency as money for the most part. And is it a medium exchange? Sure it is. Is it a unit of account? Sometimes. Is it a store of value? It's a store of value with a half-life of some amount. So what's the half-life of the money? How long does it take for the money to lose half its economic energy? Well, that's what we'll call the inflation rate. But the problem is the actual monetary inflation rate isn't reported. Nobody tracks it. So if you actually have $1 million of capital and you invest it in the dollar and you hold it there for 100 years, the dollar supply increases 7% a year on average over 100 years, which means that your capital loses half its value every 10 years. And over the course of 100 years, you're cut in half 10 times. Which means that you start with $1 million and you end up losing 99.9% of the $1 million. It gets worse if it's in a weak currency like the peso. In that case, you'd lose 99.9% of your capital in 20 years. So what is capital? Economic energy, purchasing power. Most of the time when people think about money, they think about currency, but currency is an awful way to store your economic energy. So you can't really hold money very long. And then when they think about the inflation rate, they always focus upon the CPI, Consumer Price Index. That's just it's just a manufactured synthetic metric. What's the true inflation rate, or what does inflation even mean? What the number that matters if you want to either get wealthy or stay wealthy or live a decent life is the rate of expansion of the currency supply. And if the currency supply in US dollars is expanding at, say, 10% a year, then that means you can expect every scarce desirable asset that anybody with money in America or anybody with money with dollars in the world is going to want to buy, it's going to go up at a rate of 10% a year or more. And so if you're not actually investing growing your cash flow, growing your assets via that number, you're getting poorer. Currency debasement rate. The monetary inflation rate is the rate at which the supply of currency is increasing. Over 100 years, about 7%, but in the past 20, 30 years, it looks like more like 10% in US dollar terms. And weaker currencies, 14%. And the weakest currencies, 20 to 30% a year.
Do you think that's going to stop anytime soon?
No. No, it's impossible for it to stop, because governments everywhere in the world just spend more money than they take in taxes. And so the temptation is always just to print money to pay bills, either to fight wars, or to implement government policy. If I'm going to forgive student debt, if I'm going to fight a war, if I'm going to implement a medical policy, if I'm going to, pay a bureaucracy, I have to come up with money to do it.
How long is that sustainable for?
It depends on which currency you're printing.
I guess let's talk about the dollar.
Well, let's talk about ones that are simpler. So in the event of a war, your currency collapses pretty quickly. The losing side in World War I, the currency collapsed. And between 1914 and 1917, the currencies in France and the UK were about to collapse. The only thing that saved them was the US entry into the war. So generally, in the event of a war, why do wars last 5 years? Because if the government's printing money as fast as they can, it takes about 5 years to suck all the economic energy out of the society. In the Civil War, the North printed greenbacks. They collapsed, and they were almost worth nothing by the end of the Civil War. The South printed their currency, that collapsed by the end of the war. So in wars, the currency can collapse in 5 years. If you take Argentina's collapsed their currency about every 20 or 25 years for the past 150 years. About 20 years.
Sure.
So the Argentine peso was 1 peso to the dollar about 25 years ago. It's 1,000 pesos to the dollar right now. The world reserve currency is, say, the United States. Compare the United States, the dollar. Compare it to the German currencies. The Germans have lost 2 wars, so their currencies collapsed like 3 times. How about the Japanese currency? It's collapsed, right? How about every other currency? The Russian currency. It's collapsed about 3 or 4 times. The last time it collapsed was 1998. Lebanon, it just collapsed a few years ago. U.S. won every war in the last 100 years. We are actually the strongest nation for the past 100 years. So we're the victor. We're the world reserve currency. So what has the U.S. dollar done? An acre of land in Miami Beach, where I live, cost $10,000 100 years ago. It cost $10 million today. Okay. Did the currency collapse? It's worth 0.1%, right? It lost 99.9% of its value. So, in fact, that's the winner, right? And how long will that go on? How long can it go on? I mean, at 7%, you can presumably do it another 30, 40, 50 years, something like that. But the world reserve currency goes to the end. It'll last until the mercantile empire fails. Where you see the fraying on the edges is you see the collapse of the Sri Lankan currency. You see the collapse of every currency in Africa, the collapse of the currency in Nigeria, the collapse of the currencies in Lebanon, the collapse of or the weakening of currencies in Turkey. You see that right now. Turkish lira has fallen by 75% against the dollar in the last 36 months. Generally, the biggest risk is in the second tier, third tier country. In a third tier country, your currency's broken, right? So what do? Normally, you actually just flip to the dollar. That's why is there so much demand for Tether, right? Stable coins. If you live in Argentina, you live in Nigeria, you live anywhere in Africa, it's like the dollar looks like a pretty good idea. Everybody knows what the dollar is. If your currency's falling 30% a year and the dollar is only falling in value 7% a year, it looks like the dollar is gaining, right? That goes through this currency collapse. Is this new? No, it's not new. If you read the history of the world, go read, there's 15,000 pages of Durant's Story of Civilization. I read it for fun. I reread it for fun. There's thousands of stories of an empire rising. The first king conquers, the son maintains. The third one in the line comes along and decides to overreach, overspend, debases the currency, bleeds the people dry, eventually can't pay the military and collapses. And what happens is they always blame it on the barbarians. It's like the bad people that live next door, they abused us. But what really happens is every single empire in the past 10,000 years that we've got a recorded history on, they go through this dynamic of they're weak and virtuous. They struggle. They rise against another adversary. The big, strong empire becomes fat, dumb, happy. It becomes corrupted from within. The Roman Empire, the French Empire, the Russians, the whatever, fill in the blank. And after the empire becomes corrupted within it, collapses, the new empire rises. It stays virtuous for some amount of time. It might be 50 years. It might be 100 years. It might be 200 years. Eventually, it becomes corrupted. It collapses. And this is just the story of civilization. Why are we here? Well, if Bitcoin had not been invented, this would be a pretty downer podcast. I'm just telling you that, the world's got economic problems. The government's going to debase the currency, spend it on things you disagree with, and you're going to be poor. Right? And that's how it ends. But Satoshi is as profound as Prometheus. Satoshi, Maxwell gave us electricity. Newton gave us Newtonian physics. Einstein gave us relativity. Satoshi gave us money. And it's this thing we call Bitcoin. It's the world's first engineered money. And the first engineered monetary network.
영상 잘 보셨나요? 마이클 세일러의 의견을 제가 조금 쉽게 풀어드리면 부채가 늘어나게 되면 미국은 이렇게 돈을 계속 찍어낼 것입니다. 그렇게 찍어낸 돈은 모두 시장으로 들어가게 됩니다. 시장으로 돈이 들어가게 된다면 주가가 올라가고 원자재 가격이 올라가게 되는 것입니다. 역사적으로 돌이켜보아도 역대 기축통화국들은 이와 같은 과정을 겪어왔습니다. 미국은 지금 저물어가고 있습니다. 실제로 저물어가는 시기에 빈부격차가 심해지고 국가 내부에서 내부적 갈등이 심해지고 있죠. 많은 경제 전문가들, 기사들 또한 이 얘기를 뒷받침해주고 있습니다. 미국 부채는 지금 약 34조 7천억 달러에 달하는 국가 부채를 가지고 있습니다. 5월에 부채를 갚기 위한 이자 지급액만 약 1,030억 달러라고 합니다. 1,030억 달러는 2024년 5월 전체 정부 수입의 31.7%가 사용되었다고 합니다. 이건 미국의 부채에 대한 상황을 보여주고 있는 글입니다. 이렇게 부채가 늘어나게 되면 모든 물가가 상승할 수밖에 없는데요. 미국의 임대료는 치솟고 시간당 임금은 따라가지 못한다는 글입니다. 이런 현상은 집을 갖지 못하는 사람들이 계속 늘어나고 임대료를 내기 위해 빚을 지고 그 이자만 갚으면서 부를 축적하지 못해 빈부격차 현상이 커지게 되는 것이죠. 이는 미국 국민들에게 이런 결과를 초래했습니다. 소득 증가율 80% 감소, 2조 달러의 저축 증발, 부채의 증가와 연체율 증가, 90% 국민들이 허덕이고 있다고 합니다. 이런 현상은 비단 미국 국민뿐 아니라 미국 전체의 재정에 영향을 끼치고 있는데요. 미국이 국가 부채 때문에 이탈리아보다 부실해질 수도 있다는 기사입니다. 미국의 국가 부채가 지속 불가능한 길로 들어섰다는 비관적 관측이 잇따르고 있는데요. 영국 기관에서도 미국 재정이 유럽의 대표적 재정 부실 국가인 이탈리아 수준으로 악화될 것이라는 전망을 내놓았습니다. 많은 전문가들이 지금 미국 부채에 대해 입을 모아 지적하고 있습니다. 미국의 높은 부채 수준과 이에 따른 이자 비용 증가로 인해 경제 성장의 발목을 잡혔고 미국의 신용도까지 하락하고 있다고 합니다. 또 미국의 경제 전문가 레이 달리오는 투자자들에게 자금을 해외로 분산시킨다고까지 고려해야 한다고 얘기하고 있습니다. 이렇게 지금 수많은 경제지표, 시장 거물들이 입을 모아 비트코인을 사라고 얘기해주고 있습니다. 저는 예전부터 이때 살 걸 이라는 후회를 참 많이 했었습니다. 근데 세상을 살아보니까 부딪히지 않으면 달라지는 게 없었습니다. 여러분들은 지금 비트코인 반감기와 함께 대상승의 기로에 서 계십니다. 여러분들은 오른쪽 집에 살고 싶으십니까? 저는 무조건 왼쪽입니다. 저와 왼쪽 집으로 떠나실 분들은 지금부터라도 제 힘이 닿는 데까지 도와드리겠습니다. 영상 시청해주셔서 감사드리고 잘 봐주셨다면 구독과 좋아요 부탁드리면서 영상 마무리하겠습니다. 감사합니다.